This is Professor Andrew Heiss, comes to us from very far away, a building called Marriott, you may have heard of, far to the west. Appreciate that he traveled that far. No, he works right now with Marriott School, the Romney Institute of Public Management, working on a variety of things, international NGOs, nonprofit management, authoritarianism, and this is a fun one, data visualization. So he knows very well how to put numbers on the screen in a way that is clear and interesting. And sometimes beautiful. Recently completed his doctorate in public policy from Duke University, their Sanford school, not to be confused with Stanford or Stamford. This is just Sanford School down at Duke. Works with some wonderful people, some people that I've known for a while as well. And if you're interested, you can follow him on Twitter at Andrew Heiss. And I turn the time over then to Professor Heiss.
All right. So I'm really excited to be here today because as Dr. Stiles mentioned at the beginning, he said that Corey Leonard over in the Kennedy School says, or the Kennedy Center, people study IR to either change the world or control the world or run the world. I'm over in the Marriott School, which is on not changing the world. It's more of the controlling the world, owning the world phase. So it's great to be kind of the nicer side of world politics. So just quickly, how many of you are IR majors with the Kennedy Center? Awesome. How many are political science majors? How many are neither of those? What are you guys?
Environmental science.
Cool. That's relevant.
Geography and international development.
Awesome. Also super relevant. Okay, so this is exciting because so far in this class you've been talking about large international organizations like the UN, possibly NATO, possibly like these big, famous, fancy, state-based, state members organizations. Today we're not going to talk about those guys. We're going to talk about much smaller organizations with regular people in them, not states, which is exciting because that's what you all can do. You can all participate in NGOs. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. But first, I want to start the discussion about these 4 organizations here. We have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we have Greenpeace, we have Apple, and we have ISIS, which is a good collection of organizations here. So what I want you to do is to get into groups of 3 or 4, you're mostly kind of clustered, but get together. We're going to spend the next 5 or 7 minutes talking about 3 important questions that will preview what we're going to be talking about today. So first, what do these organizations do in general? You might write this down on a piece of paper, we're going to share it back together. Some of these are easy, like make iPhones or that stuff. So we're going to talk about those. And then what kind of political power do they have in their home countries and abroad? What kind of influence do they have? And which ones have more power and why? So based on the reading you did and just your general knowledge of these things, get into little groups and talk about these things, and I will wander around and see what you got. Okay, so what do these organizations do? We were all talking about it. You Googled some of them. Hopefully you didn't Google ISIS because the NSA is listening. You know you're out here. So, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, what do they do? This group here.
They are involved in lots of humanitarian activities and trying to basically help people.
Okay. Doing what kind of things?
Well, I look at their front page. They're helping to fight poverty, they're helping to fight, I don't know, that's very basic.
A lot of public health projects. They've created a thing called World Toilet Day, which is exciting. Helping sanitation. Yes?
I was just going to add, like, they're primarily focused on HIV, AIDS, poverty, and education. It's kind of like their 4 focus groups.
Okay. So do they count as an international organization for the scope of this class?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Greenpeace, what do they do? This middle group here.
They're into raising awareness about environmental issues.
Okay. How do they do that?
They do crazy stunts sometimes. They get people to sign petitions.
Yeah, they try to use the epistemic community to try to convince people to their side. about saving the environment and use grassroots efforts quite a bit to try to get social movement.
Okay. So they're really creative. They do plug into this epistemic community, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides here, where they try to insert themselves in kind of the national discussion about the environment. So back in like the 80s, they were partially involved in like Star Trek 4, the movie, with one of the whales, trying to promote awareness of whaling. And so they also do crazy stunts where they go and like get on jet skis and surround boats and try to stop them from harpooning things. They tie themselves to trees. They do all sorts of things to promote awareness of the environment. And they go beyond that too. They lobby governments for better public policy related to the environment. Okay, what about Apple here? What do they do? This group back there. What did you guys talk
They're a
about?
huge economical power. They have huge economic powers. Very popular.
Yeah, they're super popular. Right here, you all have something Apple related, I'm guessing. Unless you're like too cool for that. Okay? So, they make stuff. What do these guys do? This group back here.
So they're trying to start a caliphate. Pretty much just promote their Islamic beliefs on everyone.
Okay. So they're trying to take over the world, starting in the Middle East and then spreading out everywhere else. Do they count as an international organization for the scope of this class? Why? They're not NATO, they're not UN. What makes them an international organization? Yeah.
I think their ability to strike fear into people all across the globe and how they've been seen in the news all over the globe, I think that gives them international attention, and therefore I think we can classify them as, to some extent, a non-state actor of international influence.
Okay, so they have some power domestically and internationally. So let's talk about that real quick. All of these are international organizations, and they have that designation either because they have members in a whole bunch of different countries, or they work on the global stage, or in the case of Apple, they have factories all over the place and they sell things everywhere, or ISIS because they're trying to take over everywhere. So what kind of political power do they have? And how powerful is that? Which ones are kind of the most powerful? So I heard some groups talking about kind of the differences between these. So what makes Greenpeace, for example, more or less powerful than the Gates Foundation? You guys? Anybody talk about that? Yes?
Well, I feel like Greenpeace, they do more lobbying type stuff, I feel like, than like the Gates Foundation does. So like, I feel like both organizations can influence like politics because of money. Like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has a ton of money, but Greenpeace does different things with the money that they raise for their causes. So they do more lobbying type stuff. So they will affect more public policies towards their cause and like making the earth a better place.
Okay. So both groups have lots of money. These guys have a political wing. What makes it different? What's the difference between Apple and Greenpeace there? Apple has a ton of money. They're probably the biggest company on the face of the planet. So how do they influence politics? We had a group back there kind of talking about Apple's political or the economic power. What are you guys talking about back there?
We kind of talked about how it just has a lot of like cultural and social influences, which I think can be really powerful in a different kind of like a domestic way.
Okay. So they have like sponsorship arrangements with like TV shows. You'll always see Apple products and things, and so they have this cultural influence. Yeah.
We talked about how they're making, well, they have influence on nations' regulation decisions. So as they create new technologies and things, they have a huge influence on national policies that adopt certain regulations, or just that sort of economic influence on politics.
Especially labor regulations, because they have a massive supply chain, and they have like Foxconn and their main factory over in China, and there's all sorts of labor issues there, and they influence heavily Chinese labor laws. Yeah.
We talked about how Apple controls a lot of personal information for people, and that's a huge power that they have.
Because then you have other organizations that do the same thing. You have Google with everything. You have Equifax, which isn't an international organization, but they have serious political issues with holding personal information. And so they do have political power because they control information, they control labor laws, they control all sorts of things. What about these guys? What kind of political power does ISIS have? Yes?
Well, superficially, you could think about just how the fact that they are, this violent non-state actor who's trying to influence kind of the regional politics of like the Middle East and abroad. But you could also think about how terrorist actions that they've done and kind of what they've undertaken has influenced things like immigration policy in Europe and people's perception of security and safety and all of those things on a global scale. So they kind of have a mixture of, kind of this hard political power and as well as a soft power that they inadvertently kind of use.
Yeah, beyond just controlling a few cities in Iraq and Syria, they were influencing huge policy debates about immigration, about all sorts of things, xenophobia, just from their little perch in Iraq and Syria. So they do have a lot of political power. So which ones, going back to this question, we were talking about money, which ones are the most powerful if you were going to rank order these? And how would you rank? Most powerful meaning what? Yes?
I feel like there's the soft power and then there's the hard power. So if you're talking specifically about hard power, definitely ISIS would be like the number one on that. And then I feel like it'd go Greenpeace, Bill and Melinda, and then Apple. But then if you're talking about like the biggest soft power influences, I'd do Apple first, and then I would probably do Bill and Melinda Gates, Greenpeace, and then ISIS. So it just depends on the context that you want to try to.
Okay, I like that answer. It depends on the context. It depends on the type of power we're talking about and what kind of influence these groups can have in world politics. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, is these three questions, kind of a more in-depth, nuanced discussion about what this power thing means and what influence means for an NGO or for any non-state actor. So the plan for today is we'll talk briefly about what are these non-state actors, what makes them non-state. It's fairly easy because they're not states. And then what do they have to do with international relations and with domestic politics? So all of this political science stuff that you're learning, these types of organizations fit in political calculations and fit in global governance. And so we're going to talk about how they do that. Because there have been some fierce debates over time about, do these organizations even matter in politics? Should we even be looking at them? And then we're going to talk specifically about NGOs and what they do, and how they can be more or less effective, and what effectiveness means if you're an NGO. Okay? So first, what are non-state actors? This is a fun little slide here because non-governmental organization generally just means you're not a government and you're not a business. You're somewhere in between. Another term for it is called the third sector, where you're not a private firm and you're not a government, you're something else. And it's tricky because they define themselves by what they're not. So what are they? Any ideas about, what do you think of when you hear the word NGO? You generally think of something besides just something that's not a government. What are NGOs in your mind?
I feel like a lot of times what we call them in the US, like a domestic NGO, would be what we term nonprofits. So organizations that all of their revenues and stuff go back into their business, and they usually fulfill some kind of social purpose to improve society.
Mm-hmm. So the technical term, like we have nonprofit organizations, they're registered as 501c3 organizations here in the United States. They have no owners, there's no shareholders, their own kind of private public interest, and their volunteers, and everything goes towards some kind of social goal. NGOs, to some extent, are basically that on a global scale. It's tricky because every single country has different laws governing kind of this voluntary sector, this third sector. And so there's no perfectly universal definition of an NGO, but in general you can think of kind of a voluntary association where people are working together, donating time, donating money towards some sort of pro-social goal in the end. There are all sorts of different types of NGOs. There are international NGOs that are based in one country and work in a variety of other countries. There are government-operated NGOs, which is seemingly a paradox because it's a government-operated non-governmental organization. You see these a lot in more repressive countries. So Egypt, for example, back when President Mubarak was president, there was a large foundation called the Suzanne Mubarak Foundation, run by his wife. And it received lots and lots of government money. and crowded out the sector for regular Egyptian nonprofits because the government was running kind of its own nonprofit, and it was a way to funnel money around to different people and kind of run corruption. But there's all sorts of gongos, these government-operated NGOs, all over the world. They're briefcase-operated NGOs. So far we've been talking about NGOs as kind of these good things, these good guys that go out and save the world. Lots of NGOs, though, are really good at finding money from donors. And so they just kind of pop up a little NGO that's run by one person and get a whole bunch of government funding, and then maybe they'll go out and do something and maybe not. And so you get this all over the place. We're going to talk about this later in countries like Haiti and Afghanistan, where they're kind of these like giant glut of NGOs, and they're all run by these kind of one-man bands. You have bingos, which have lots of different definitions. People just like these acronyms. So it could be a big international NGO, a briefcase international NGO, or a business-oriented NGO. All of those just have different focuses. If it's a business-run NGO, that could be arguably the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, though at this point it's broken off far enough from Microsoft that it's not like an arm of Microsoft, but it's related to that company. And then you have donor-operated NGOs, which are kind of larger organizations where big donors, like in the United States, we have the National Endowment for Democracy that helps with democracy assistance around the world, and they fund two large organizations called the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute, and they both work on democracy promotion, but they're funded by kind of the NED, so it's kind of a donor-operated NGO. And finally, you have quasi-NGOs, which aren't really non-governmental, they're not NGOs, they're just something weird. And you'll come across that in literature about these non-NGO NGOs that don't fit any category. Okay? Any questions about this alphabet soup here? We almost have a question. Yes?
So at what point does it become a donor-operated NGO? Like, what's the threshold for when funds donated by individuals directly impact what the NGO does?
Mm-hmm. So I think it goes back to the amount of power that the donors have. In many nonprofits and NGOs, the donor gives money and says, go do something with it. In the case of the NED, kind of funding IRI and NDI, it says you're going to go do something with this, and that something is X, and you will go do this. And so those organizations just kind of take their marching orders from the larger donors and have a lot less say in what they actually do. And so at that point, it kind of comes over into the donor-operated. These are not actually legal terms. You can't register as a dongo. You're just an NGO or a 501c3 or whatever, but you take on a different nature depending on your relationship with your donors, or the government that you're hosted by, or the government that you're hosted in. Okay? All right. Epistemic communities. We talked about that. That was in your reading. This is a fun term because it's epistemic. Which makes you sound really smart. It really just means like expert communities or communities of scholars. So the best example today of this is kind of the climate change movement, where you have climate scientists, you have environmental activists, you have all of these different groups holding conferences at boring giant hotels about climate change. But there's kind of a global consensus among these different scientists and different activists that climate change is a serious policy issue. And so based on that community of scholars and community of activists, they can go to regular international organizations like the UN and host conferences and try to promote global public policy. But it's because there's this community of scholars who all agree with each other and they can work towards this common goal. They're not a formally registered NGO, they're not a formally registered organization at all, it's just a group of people working towards a common goal. Okay, is that good? All right, multinational corporations. These are fun because they are organizations. This is kind of easier to find because they're registered as a business and they have a purpose of generating profit for their shareholders. That's why businesses exist. But they wield enormous political power because of the money that they have. So we have Chiquita, makes bananas. But in the early 20th century, they worked closely with the CIA and other groups in the federal government to overthrow the Central American countries they were working, or to control coups so they could get better profits. So that helped. That's why we have lots of bananas. These guys, Google and Apple. We already talked about Apple, how they have a lot of cultural influence, but they also have a lot of influence on global supply chains and controlling which countries manufacture which parts of the iPhone. And just by sending out different competition announcements, they can get different factories competing for different parts, and they can control entire global supply chains. Google as well, when they decided they wanted to go into China, they had to grapple with Chinese censorship laws and figure out how they wanted to square their mission of indexing the world's information with China's imperative to not talk about Tiananmen Square or other major issues. And so it was a tricky thing, but because they caved in on the censorship issue, any other organization that's been going into China at this point, Facebook, Twitter, they also have to kind of toe that line because they have an enormous level of political power at the beginning and helped set that policy. And then finally, you have oil and gas companies that do similar things to fruit companies, and they just are able to work with countries to help set different public policies that are either favorable to them or ignore different regulations or help set the different regulations that they have in the countries. And it's not always bad. Apple, because of pressure from activists in the United States, has improved their global supply chains and improved labor laws in the different countries they're working in. So in general, you don't have as many suicides at Foxconn, for example. It's kind of improved over time. Okay, so MNCs, multinational corporations, any questions on that? That's all generally clear. And they are, technically speaking, international organizations because they work internationally. Finally, we have transnational advocacy networks, which are different from all of those others. These are kind of similar to the epistemic community idea, where you have an issue, some sort of global issue, and you have a collection of organizations and experts and academics and corporations all working towards that issue. And so one famous example is from the 1830s to 1860s. There was an Anglo-American abolitionist movement led by a whole bunch of women's organizations in New England and in regular England, and corporations that were against slavery and against the importation of slaves. And they all worked together with different governments in Europe to kind of push an abolitionist stance, an abolitionist policy, kind of leading up to the Civil War. And in the end, they had an enormous influence on the global discussion, the global conversation about slavery. There was no central office of like anti-abolitionism. There was a whole bunch of different groups and companies and countries, but they all worked together to create something powerful. We have a modern movement kind of like this campaign to stop killer robots, where there's concern that autonomous weapons like drones can get out of hand. They're not regulated by the Geneva Conventions or any other kind of laws regulating weapons. And so there are groups like Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International, and academics and countries that are concerned with killer robots. And so it creates this transnational advocacy network where these activists in these countries can all work with the UN or work with large organizations like Amnesty to kind of change the global conversation about killer robots, and it creates a global movement. And so that needs to change just because of these networks of organizations. But again, there's no central person controlling all of this. It's just because there's a network, it can lead to global policy change. And finally, you have terrorist and criminal networks. So we talked about ISIS. They also have the mafia. We have MS-13. And these exert political power just through violence and terror. And so you can take entire other classes on kind of terrorism. But for our purposes here, they are considered an international organization because they can exert global influence without kind of a central leader, and they can affect policy change, as we've seen with immigration and other things. Okay, any questions on them? All right. What does any of this have to do with international politics or domestic politics even? So think back to when you took Political Science 170. You learned about realism and liberalism and constructivism, all those other isms. Who wants to summarize the idea of realism? If you remember that from so long ago. Yes?
So its primary conception is that states are the primary actor in relations between countries, essentially nation states as they became after the Treaty of Westphalia, and that hard power and self-preservation are the primary motivating factors for these states, and that they're all rational and seeking to further that purpose of maintaining security and power within the realm in which they reside. So.
Okay. I like that. We also had another hand.
Ditto. Yeah.
Sweet. All right. So, yeah, the main actors are states. States interact with each other. States go to war with each other. States blow each other up. States yell at each other, impose sanctions to each other. It's all state-centric. What role do NGOs play in kind of a typical realist world if you were a theorist back in the 50s and 60s and 70s? I see nods, yes, or
Very little. I mean, realists will recognize the presence of non-state actors, and depending on the condition, will recognize some influence that they do have, what they have done, but primarily it's a state-focused idea, and therefore the idea of non-state actors is significantly downplayed in what they do.
yeah.
And oftentimes when they do recognize them and the power that they do have, they often see that power is derived from a state that is just a tool of a state to further their purposes abroad, essentially.
Yep. So non-state actors are just actors, state actors, just hiding as non-state actors. And they don't do anything. And there's some famous quotes from this literature back in the day talking about the power of non-state actors in global politics. This is from a theorist back in the 60s saying that the International Tiddlywinks Federation counts for little in a world of armed states. Which is true. So the International Tiddlywinks Federation may have been an actual thing. It was probably mostly facetious here, but creating kind of a community of Tiddlywinks players and having kind of a fun conference where you can go and play the game, however you play it, the little colored circles that you played in your grandparents' basement probably, because who even plays that nowadays? And so that is technically an international organization. But what are they going to do in the Cold War? Like, nothing. And so why even care about them in global politics? Or, this is another fun quote, in 1935, Stalin was asked about what he would do about the Pope, and he said, how many divisions does the Pope have? Like, the Catholic Church isn't going to fight Russia or Soviet Union at that point. And so, similarly, scholars were saying, how many divisions have the NGOs? If you're Amnesty International and you're yelling at a country for executing dissidents, why should you listen to Amnesty? If you're just worried about self-preservation and attacking other states and looking at interstate security, you can't, Amnesty is just a little fly, you don't care about them, right? And so how many divisions does Amnesty have? Like, they're not gonna invade your country, so they're not a risk. But NGOs do play a role. Like, we have a whole session of a class talking about NGOs. We have a whole class focused on international organizations. Realists back in the day dismissed lots of these other international organizations beyond the non-state actors because they're not states. So what do NGOs do? We know that Amnesty yells at people. We know that Greenpeace circles whaling boats and ties themselves to trees. But to what purpose, and why do states listen to them? Do states listen to them? Were the realists right? Any thoughts on that? Yeah.
They can be experts in certain fields and like give more research than the government can have, or they can also help with like measuring the effects that certain policies have. So they can help both domestically and internationally that way.
Okay. I buy that. They have expertise. They can consult governments. Yeah.
Depending on how a country views itself and its international reputation, they have varying abilities to affect countries in particular. So if a country doesn't really care what other countries have to think about it, then they're less willing to listen to other actors and how they'll be perceived. Like if you have a dictatorship that's very self-contained, then Amnesty International comes and condemns them. They still don't care because they're still not interacting with anyone else. So NGOs have a lot more power in set communities that often interact and care what each other think for
Okay.
future work.
So think like a realist really quick. Why would a state care about its reputation? Why would it care about being yelled at? Yeah.
I mean, if other countries perceive the country as weak, then they would care. Right? So they might not necessarily care about, breaking human rights left and right, but if the entire rest of the global community cares and thereby perceives them as weaker and won't take their threats as seriously afterwards, then they would care.
Okay. So it does kind of harm the state's standing in this whole anarchy world where you care about your position. If somebody's yelling at you and saying you're executing dissidents or you're not following international norms, that could be bad. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Might also affect economically to that nation if the green organization says, okay, your trees or your water is contaminated, then investors will not come.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so it leads to sanctions, it leads to other economic consequences, which then makes it really dangerous in your anarchic world and countries can invade. Any other thoughts? I saw a partial hand. Yes?
One other thing is that it leads to less interaction, and so the less interaction you have over time, usually the worse place you have at the table. And so when you try to negotiate further and get more information further on, or have allies there for you when you go to attack another pole, then it's much less likely if the people around you continually condemn you. So that can have an effect as well.
Okay, cool. I buy that. All that makes sense. Any disagreements? Any hardcore realists here saying, no, ignore these NGOs? Hopefully not. All right, so as we saw, NGOs are not states. They have less political power. They have less access. If you're an NGO, it's hard to get access to the UN to go try to affect policy change. There are ways to get official UN status, but there are only like 2,000 of these organizations, and you have to go through a long process to get certified as a UN certified NGO. And it's difficult. And they're not always political either. If you are Save the Children, what kind of political power do you have? And does that even matter in international politics? Or if you're Oxfam, or if you're any of these kind of humanitarian NGOs, what kind of influence do those guys have in global politics if you're not trying to be political? Do they have any influence? Should we just ignore them and only look at Amnesty and Human Rights Watch? Any thoughts on that? Is there political value, political power in not being political? Yeah.
I mean, it kind of affects your how the international community perceives you if you're not receptive to humanitarian aid, or if you if this group that kind of has this moral reason to be there is for some reason not being supported or accepted by your state organization, it gives them kind of this like moral high ground. And if like the Taliban kicking out a lot of NGOs from Afghanistan back in like the 90s and the 2000s, that really reflected badly on the regime because it showed that they didn't care about their people or how the Afghan people were. They just wanted to maintain control over their territory that they had, and that kind of affected the international perception of what the Taliban was about.
Okay. So it's connected to reputation again. Yeah.
It also affects a lot of arbitration between countries if you're not political, because countries are a lot less willing to be arbitrated between if they view it as skewed.
Okay. So you have to have general perception of being easy to work with. How does this connect, though? Because at the core of realism is this idea of like national sovereignty. You're your own country. You're trying to preserve yourself in the real world. How does inviting the Red Cross into your country relate with sovereignty? Like if there's an earthquake in Pakistan, what do you do if you want to maintain national sovereignty, but you also have the Red Cross there saying, hey, we want to come help? How do you square that if you are Pakistan? Do Do you even care? Is that a difficult decision or not? Because Red Cross isn't necessarily political. Yeah.
Well, I feel like if you're going to maintain national sovereignty, you need to keep your citizens satisfied and happy, and by allowing like the Red Cross to come in and they can attend to those needs that maybe you don't have the infrastructure to take care of, because if you leave those needs unattended, then people are less likely to support the regime.
Okay, so there's a balance there. You need to provide services if you're a government. And after an earthquake, that's kind of difficult time to provide services because everything's been wiped out. And so you kind of have to invite other organizations in your country to help out with that. What are the risks of doing that? We have benefits there, like provide services, tents, etc. But
I believe it was the example given in our textbook of Haiti, where since there was so much international donation and organizations that came in to help rebuild the infrastructure, that it basically weakened the Haitian government and corrupted it more because they were essentially ineffective and only nominal in what they did. So basically you just weaken your sovereignty to the point that you don't actually do anything about the problem that exists.
And so if you're another country and you're looking at Haiti and what happened to Haiti, you're going to be somewhat hesitant to allow lots and lots of NGOs in your country. It's hard. But just that political calculation there shows that these organizations have some sort of political power, even if they're non-political, because there's a danger to regime stability, to sovereignty, to whatever, in inviting them. So it becomes a difficult decision. And so these NGOs do matter in world politics. And nowadays there are no more like hardcore realists anymore. That was the thing back in the day. Even today's neo-realists recognize that NGOs have a role in international governance. And liberals and constructivists and everybody else just kind of talks about that. That NGOs do have a role. And they all have different theoretical flavors of how they address NGOs, and your textbook talks about that. So what do these groups do then? Since they have this potentially political power, they have some role in global governance. In general, people categorize NGOs as doing one of two broad things. One way to look at this is they help promote or they help fix freedom from want. They address those kinds of issues. So this is where humanitarian services would fit in. Helping people with poverty, helping people with disaster relief. So you have the International Rescue Committee, IRC. They work very closely with refugees. They're kind of the main NGO right now dealing with the Syrian refugee crisis and the East African refugee crisis. They're kind of a big name for assisting with refugees. Again, not overtly political. They're just assisting with this freedom from want idea. You have Oxfam, which is a big international NGO based in the UK, and they do similar things. They go build wells in small villages. They help with just general humanitarian or international development, humanitarian aid. You have Save the Children, similar things, promoting education around the world. You even have LDS charities. We exist doing this stuff. We have programs where we help with neonatal resuscitation training in developing countries. We give like ophthalmologist training. We give wheelchairs out. We do all sorts of charitable activities unrelated to missionary work, unrelated to any of the normal church stuff. But it's all focused on this idea of helping people with the freedom from want. Okay? On the other side, you have organizations helping with freedom from fear. And these are generally the advocacy organizations, promoting human rights, promoting respect for human dignity, things like that. And so you have groups like the Committee to Protect Journalists, which are kind of like an Amnesty International for journalists. And they keep track of how many journalists have been killed or imprisoned, and they have a giant database of this online, and you can track which countries are the most dangerous for journalism. And then they submit annual reports and say these countries are bad and these countries are good, these countries should reform. And so they try to have some sort of political platform to fix journalism and anti-government attitudes toward it. You have the Carter Center. They monitor elections and make sure that elections are run fairly and there's no cheating, that everything works well, so that it, in theory, minimizes oppression in different countries. So it's more democratic and people can vote and have more say in their government. You have Amnesty, they're kind of the poster child for this freedom from want group, just promoting human rights in general. They started out as kind of an anti-death penalty organization and led letter writing campaigns to imprison people. But now they've expanded to lots and lots of different issue areas, but all focused on this idea of helping people with the freedom from fear. Another organization is Polaris. They work with human trafficking and promoting human trafficking laws in different countries, and they actually send people in and lobby for criminalization of human trafficking. There's a BYU grad, you may have seen him, I remember his name, but he was an ex-CIA guy, and now he goes around and liberates people from human trafficking, working with governments, and works, kind of has his own little NGO, and that's what he does. He's like a paramilitary NGO guy. But also focused on this idea of helping people with the freedom from fear. So these are these types of NGOs here. It's tricky because they all have different strategies, and they're all working with states. So how are these 4 different organizations working with states here? Just based on the background they gave you. What does the CPJ do with other governments? And it wants to promote this idea of freedom from fear. How does it do that? Yeah.
From what I understand, it wants to try to regulate both laws regarding freedom of speech as well as police protection and the use of government's force against journalists, and basically what constitutes safety for the public good, as well as the information the public needs to be free from fear of their government and what they do.
And so how do they do that?
By protecting journalists as they report on issues that are relevant to countries, even though they might be in dangerous situations, and to try to prevent police crackdowns against journalists. And I know, like in Russia, that they have a big problem with if journalists are critical of the president, then they oftentimes end up dead. So try to keeping them alive. It's usually good.
And they do that by having one office in the United States. And they issue regular reports, and they send lawyers into different countries to help with legal issues. But in general, they're just based in here, and they work internationally, but that's what they do. What about the Carter Center? Is anybody familiar with how they operate? They monitor elections, so how do they do that? Cool. Nobody knows about them because you didn't have to read them. Surprise. So at the Carter Center, they monitor elections on the ground in the countries that they're monitoring. So they set up an office 6 months before the election, or X number of months before the election. They have people on the ground at all of these different polling stations, and they make sure everything's running smoothly. And then they stay in the country for a few months after to write up the final report and present it to the Election Commission. And so they are very, very on the ground and working directly with the government. Here they're just kind of yelling at the government. Here they're working closely with them. Amnesty, how do they work? Yes.
So, at least in the US, they have 2 researchers who try and kind of research and demonstrate how the human rights violations all over the world, especially the US. They have a big team of lobbyists. They have a big office in DC where they try and implement, and they try and implement the UN. And so they mainly through lobbyism, and that's their main way, and documentation. So they have a lot of people on the ground as well, usually volunteers.
Yeah. So, kind of like the CPJ, they issue urgent action reports, they issue all sorts of press releases saying, this is a dangerous situation, we should address that. But they don't have lawyers on the ground addressing that all the time. They work mostly with Congress and with the UN and other main governmental organizations to try to push their agenda and address issues in other countries. And then Polaris, they do a similar thing. They don't have a lot of direct lobbying. They do in some countries when they want to target one and say they're about to pass a criminalization statute for human trafficking. They'll send some people in to help. But they also have just a big list of all the NGOs working on human trafficking. They have a ranking system for how bad trafficking is in different countries. And so it's more kind of from a distance. They're not directly working with governments. But in the end, all 4 of these groups, even though they have wildly different strategies and wildly different relationships with governments, they're doing stuff with governments and they're influencing policy and politics in different ways. Okay? often you can oppose states as an NGO. And there's an interesting process for this. The way that these international NGOs get used to influence domestic policy. And it's called the boomerang effect, which looks like this, which doesn't even look like a boomerang. It's not the Australian thing, but the process works like a boomerang. So what happens with the boomerang effect, this is especially important with like Amnesty and other groups that have kind of this national influence without being directly involved on the ground. You have domestic NGOs that care about human rights abuses in a country. And they try to lobby their home government to say you should stop killing people or arresting people. And in general, the home government's not going to respond to the NGOs. And so with the boomerang pattern, the domestic NGOs go talk to Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and to the Committee to Protect Journalists and those other NGOs focused on human rights advocacy. They then work with other states, with UN organizations, other groups that have like, stronger political power, which then they can then impose sanctions on the recalcitrant government. They can do things to make them change those policies. And so it's kind of this roundabout way of getting at the government through these international NGOs. And so it's a way for these groups right here to oppose governments directly and influence policy change at the same time. But they have to have some connection with domestic NGOs to be able to do that. It's more difficult to just decide you're going to affect policy change in the country if you're Amnesty with no connections on the ground. And that's why they have so many other researchers and volunteers that they work with, so they can have that on-the-ground connection to start this whole boomerang effect. Okay? There's also an idea called the spiral model, which is basically this boomerang thing over and over and over again until norms change and until ideas of the state abuse of human rights change over time. A good example of this is human trafficking. In 2000-ish, 1999, the U.S. helped create the Palermo Protocol, which was a UN treaty that criminalized, or was supposed to criminalize worldwide human trafficking. And countries who signed on to the Palermo Protocol were supposed to pass laws in their countries saying we will criminalize human trafficking, and gave guidelines about how to do that. And so lots of countries started signing it. Domestic NGOs in those countries where they hadn't been signing it yet started working with Amnesty and working with the State Department and working with other international organizations focused on that, who then talked to the governments and tried to get them to criminalize. And so once they passed the criminalization statutes, the NGOs would say they're not being enforced. And so they would talk to these guys and talk to the State Department and get them to convince the government to start enforcing them. And then they would notice that it wasn't equal enforcement, or it wasn't kind of an accepted norm. People were still kind of snickering when they had to say, oh, we don't like human trafficking, but we're not going to change labor standards yet because we like relying on human trafficking. And so repeated boomerangs eventually leads to the acceptance of kind of this global norm against human trafficking. And it's because these NGOs and the domestic NGOs play a very important role in kind of pushing that forward and promoting advocacy. Okay? So any questions about that? Does this boomerang process make sense? Can you think of any other situations where you may have seen this? Right now, this is human trafficking. Where else might this work? If you're a human rights NGO concerned about something, how could you address that, given the other NGOs that we've talked about today? Ideas? If you're an election monitoring NGO, what do you do? Walk me through the boomerang process if you want to improve election monitoring in the country. Somebody represent the Carter Center here. We have almost thoughts. You feel willing to take it on?
I can try.
All right.
So I guess the Carter Center, if they're concerned about unfair elections in a specific country, they can talk to the international community about it.
Okay.
I don't know who would be the appropriate authority to go to there. And I mean, I assume they'd have to also work a lot with the government of the country that they want to monitor, because I don't think they can go in without the government's cooperation.
Yep, so they need permission to go in. So they're kind of up here. They work directly with the government to do something. How do they decide, according to this model, how would they decide to go in? You just wake up one day and say, hey, we're going to go monitor.
A domestic NGO would ask them to monitor.
Okay, so you have people on the ground requesting monitor. And they're pretty good about just like keeping tabs on all the elections going on so they don't have to wait all the time for somebody to come ask them. But in general, there is that domestic coordination. They work with activists on the ground to help staff all of the different polling locations, polling observation stations. But then it works. So it's that same boomerang thing. And you can apply this to any other sort of kind of human rights advocacy position where there's some issue on the ground, they go talk to the international community, and then they talk to the government, and then something happens or not. Okay? Does that make sense? You can also collaborate with states. So this is when you're angry at the government, you have to get around them and affect policy change. You can also work directly with the states, even if they are kind of a dictatorship or a more recalcitrant state. Good example of this, there's a few good examples. Lifting Hands International. You may have heard about these guys in the news recently. It's run by a BYU grad, actually, who majored in Middle East Studies back in 2008. And she runs, it's a one-person NGO. She operates all of the humanitarian services and education services in a refugee camp in Greece, and raises money from communities in Utah and Arizona and Idaho, which she's from here, and sends all of her stuff and goes and lives in Greece for extended periods of time running this refugee camp. She has a contract with the government of Greece to run that one camp, and she's in charge of all educational materials and all humanitarian services there. So if you're Greece, why did you do that? Why do you outsource that to this tiny NGO run by one person? Yeah?
One less thing to worry about.
One less thing to worry about, okay? It does simplify your life because there are lots of refugee camps. Also, more cynically, like if it fails, it's not your fault. It's the NGO, they didn't live up to what you told them. So it does kind of help offset the pressure of being a state managing all these refugees. What dangers are there in doing this? If you're Lifting Hands International, is there anything you're worried about when you're collaborating that closely with the state? Yeah.
The influence of state politics on what you can and cannot teach and cannot do for individuals.
Mm-hmm. So she has a contract with one refugee camp. If anything happens to that refugee camp, she's out of the country and has to move to a different part of Greece or move to Turkey or move somewhere. And it's a really precarious situation to be in. Just this summer, because of domestic politics within Greece, there's lots of anti-refugee sentiment. The Greek government temporarily canceled her contract. And so she had to move outside of the camp and went kitty corner from the camp and set up kind of tents there and had to bring refugees out and teach them school and provide water and everything. But they had to leave the camp to do that and then they could go back in the camp. But government regulations had soured. It was difficult. And because she was a tiny organization, she couldn't use this mechanism. She tried talking to the State Department, but the State Department ignored her. She tried talking with other big organizations that she had partnered with in Greece, but they were all facing similar issues, and so nobody could kind of start that boomerang process. So she just had to wait it out. And just this month, she's been able to get back into that camp and move back. But it was a difficult, precarious situation to be in. What about these guys? This is the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Back in the 90s, before he became president with Mohammed Morsi after the Arab Spring, the Muslim Brotherhood took on a very powerful humanitarian role in Egypt. There was a large earthquake in the early 90s, and they set up field hospitals, and they set up all sorts of humanitarian services throughout the country to help out after the election, or the disaster. Earthquake, not election. Are there any dangers with doing that if you're the NGO or the state, partnering with an organization like this directly? What might those dangers be? for those risks. Yeah.
There's typically little regulation on NGOs, and so you don't always know what they're up to or what could happen if you partner with one, or what the perception will be in the future. So if their stance changes or they do anything horrible, it can reflect badly on either one. So it can leave a sour taste in the mouth.
Okay. What else? We had a partial hand or no?
That's basically.
Cool. All right. Leading up to the Muslim Brotherhood kind of taking over humanitarian services, they were labeled as a terrorist organization. And so this was kind of their way of switching the PR discussions about them, which was great for them, and it kind of built up more popular support, and eventually they were able to win an election, become president of their area. But they also provided the needed services the state had to provide. So it was a difficult thing there. You also have Article 19, that's kind of like Committee to Protect Journalists, but for Europe. They've been working in Tunisia and have been lobbying the Tunisian government after the Arab Spring, rewriting NGO laws, and rewriting freedom of expression laws. And they've been directly involved in the drafting of these laws. And several of them have passed, and it's become national policy because the NGO is working directly with the state. In this case, the state welcomed it because they didn't want to be seen as Egypt. They wanted to be seen as the successful case. So they invited Article 19 and said, we want the best freedom of expression laws in the whole region. Tell us what to do. And it worked. The risks there are maybe they go too far, or maybe the laws wouldn't be effective, or would be too selfishly focused on just Article 19 and like carving out a niche for them to stay in the country but nobody else. But in general, it helped out with the state, and there was good collaboration there. Finally, you can have intense collaboration with states. And this is a fun figure from Dr. Stiles' work here. This on the Taliban. Today. The process done. Don't get much. Yelped because
that
I really think in
Yeah. drones. Most of its money. And private. So that's NGOs and world politics, non-state actors. Any questions before we go? We have like 30 seconds. Silence. All right, you're all NGO experts now. All right.